You're listening to Station, a short story written and read by Philip Ballerscheff. If you'd like to read along as I read these stories, you can find a link to my blog in the description of this video. And as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Observant as he was, the longer he looked at something, the more details rose to the surface and revealed themselves to him. It had begun to rain early that morning while it was still dark. He had just stepped out the door then and had hurried back inside to put a raincoat on. His suitcase in one hand, his briefcase in the other, and the hood of his coat pulled over his head, he went off again a little faster than before. His luggage contained, besides the necessities of every trip, his laptop and the few papers he took with him. Paper was the better to take aft and pore over at a moment's notice. Getting up early, he knew the day would come to seem longer to him than to those who had slept in. Setting down his luggage at the doorstep, which he closed for a second time that day, he rubbed his eyes with his fists and then more gently with his fingers, moving them in a slow circular motion. It worked well enough. That was all he could think of to wake himself up. The hardest part would be getting there and recovering from the fatigue of travel. The rain lasted until it was light out, midway through his first train ride, and that rain was now falling from the roof of the train station at which he waited for his second train. It had been early when he'd taken the first train, and there had been hardly anyone there. He took a seat without needing to push someone aside for it or to elbow his way through. He couldn't have done that if he'd had to. Though not exactly thin and short, he wasn't the tall and broad-shouldered sort of man you needed to be for that kind of thing to come naturally to you either. And besides, it wasn't in his character. In a crowd, he got through by fitting himself through the spaces people left between themselves, making room for him, if only for a moment. He wondered if he had ever been awake at such a time before. It wasn't likely. He slept well and didn't usually have a reason or want to be up so late. If he was more than a little unhappy about getting up at such an hour, he consoled himself with the thought that this was a novel experience for him. Now in high spirits, he waved to the very few people he met on the street. He took a window seat and waited, and as the train began moving, he sat at the window, looking out, and was scarcely aware of what he saw, the little there was to see in the darkness that had yet to lift. There was no moon, not that he could see, and soon enough it was light. Though the train started with a jerk and the world outside went by quickly, it was always distinct and visible, even as the train accelerated and maintained the speed it had gained. The thin line of dawn grew and grew, covering the whole of the sky, until it was no longer a line at all. The city receded and green fields replaced it. No danger of getting wet anymore. He kept his coat on anyway, because of the cold air the rain had brought. He noticed his coat was beaded with raindrops. He started to wipe them off with his hands, beginning with his sleeves, but he soon stopped. The sun would dry it for him, and there was something he liked about how the raindrops looked in the light. He saw the sun catching in the trees, its light shining in the leaves, visible only, he thought, once it had come up against something. This, on the way he was taking by train to the town his seminar was to be held. To the town in which his seminar was to be held. It was one of the longer stops he'd had so far. Was to be one of the longer stops he'd have. His schedule gave him 10 minutes to change trains, and the delay the speakers announced soon after he got off gave him a further 3 on top of that. He had his route plan on his phone, but just the same, he looked at the map the station provided. The map was a tangle of train lines, which the station had helpfully color-coded. He tried to untangle and make sense of them. He knew where he had to be to take the next train. He was there already. He stared at the display anyway, to understand it and also to pass the time with something productive. Even with time to kill, he hated to be wasteful. He had come here right after arriving, going straight through the corridor that separated the platforms, pushing past the beggars and thieves that stood there and bothered those of the passing crowd that stopped to listen. He had advanced towards the next station at a steady pace, even before a man had accosted him and given him a reason to rush and something to put behind him. People stood about the station, some in groups. You could usually tell which were beggars by the shabby way they looked, which was not the case with thieves, except for the shifty, nervous look first-timers wore, and which the experienced learned to suppress. A man got up off the wall he was leaning on and came towards him, too close for his liking. Getting too close for his liking. The man plucked him by the sleeve. Normally, they did everything but touch you, so you didn't feel you could complain. The man offered him a rose or some other trinket. He didn't look to see what it was exactly. He knew the trick was to grab his attention and then his wallet. "No, thank you," he said. He looked past the man as he said this, and except for this polite refusal, he pretended not to notice him. The man tugged on his sleeve a bit harder and kept trying to press the rose into his hand. He repeated what he'd said more firmly and didn't thank the man this time, straightening himself and glaring at him, raising his arm defensively to keep him at a distance. The man refused to let up and put himself in his way. "For you," the man said, thrusting the rose at him insistently. He had gone from holding the rose delicately between his fingers to clenching it in his fist, the gesture more forceful and his threat more pronounced. With the man blocking his way, he was suddenly forced to stop. With the man blocking his way, he came to a sudden stop. The woman walking behind him stopped as suddenly as he had. Was kicking him in the heel with the foot she had raised to take her next step. "Watch where you're going," she shouted, right into his ear. He didn't turn around, not at the kick nor at the noise. The man walking behind the woman then ran into her and gave her a similar warning, and the people behind him all ran into each other. The whole flow of people around him halted for a moment. If you stood outside of it, you could see the motion move like a ripple through the crowd that he, by stopping, had set himself apart from. Some of those in the crowd who were in fact bystanders stopped to watch what was happening and further brought things to a halt. A moment later, people realized what the problem was and went around him, muttering to themselves as they passed. The woman who had kicked him began to go around him too, and the thief, looking back at him as if to ask why he had made himself such an inconvenience. He saw little of the commotion he had caused. His attention was turned to the man in front of him. Still he could see, along with the woman's furious, accusatory glare, that the rest of the crowd was going around him too. Just as he was about to warn the man to leave him alone for a third time, he backed away without waiting to be told again. The man didn't seem frightened. In fact, his refusals had all been for nothing. The man hadn't paid them any mind. What had done it was that he'd seen he was wasting his time and cut his losses. The man had only come a step or two towards him, and by the same number of steps rejoined the row of people from which he had come. Now that one of them had tried to rob him, he guessed the rest of them were no better. Probably working with the man too, he thought as he checked himself to see that nothing had been stolen. Once at his station, he had gone over to the map of train lines to take his mind off what had happened. Finding the station he was at on the map, and then the line to which he was changing over, he traced it as far as it went until the end. That's where he would change trains again. Satisfied that his route was what he thought it was, he sat down at a bench next to a young woman. He had arrived at the station at a time when the others there were heading off to work. He made conversation with her about this and about the trip he was taking. She told him she was an intern at a hospital, a couple of stations from here, she said, turning and pointing to where her train would be going. She was taking a different train from his own. He hesitated over whether to tell her this, whether she would care, and then finally he spoke. "My train's coming from over there," he said, turning around slightly to point over the back of the bench and at the tracks on the other side of the station. She was wearing a jacket over light brown over a short dress. It was thin and looked soft like deerskin. Unlike his rain jacket, what she was wearing wasn't strictly functional, not in cut, material, or color. To wear it as well as she did, she had to be slender like the jacket. Remarking on their difference in clothes, he explained that he had set off while it was raining that morning, and that this was the reason for the raincoat. "Oh, that's why. I was wondering about that." She had in fact accepted his appearance without question, and now that she knew the reason behind it, was surprised it hadn't occurred to her to ask. "Oh, and congratulations on your internship," he said belatedly. That was what he had been going to say before the other things came to mind. As if to make up for it, he heaped praise on her, and it came on especially strong because he knew being a doctor was difficult and didn't know what went into being a medical intern, or how many steps there were between the two. He accepted his compliments without protest, not at all embarrassed to hear such things, even coming from a stranger like him. "And how is it," he asked, "being an intern? What do they have you do?" "Oh, everything," she said. "Everything they don't have the time for, I do for them." "Like what?" She hesitated, thinking how best to explain the full scope of her duties. "Well, I examine the patients, put that in their file, try a diagnosis and a treatment, then put that in their file, and tell the doctors so they know what I've done. I free them up for other things." She counted them off on her fingers. She avoided the concrete. He guessed she didn't think details would do her any good or mean anything to him, or mean much to him. "Oh," he said. That was all he said, not so much to express surprise at how demanding it was, than to remark on what he had heard. She went on, "We supervise patients too. The doctors supervise us most of the time." Lastly, she said, she called on or met with patients' families to let them know how things were going, if the patients couldn't do that themselves. This last description was a little more elaborate than those that had come before. This last description was a little more elaborate than the rest, or, or than those that had come before. Here she definitely drew from her own experience, if she hadn't done that for the rest as well. He asked her further questions, most of which he trusted himself to come up with an answer for, if he took a most of which he trusted himself to answer if he took a minute to think about it, but he wanted to keep her talking. And when she said something he could have figured out for himself, he couldn't have made her aware of this anyway. "And how long are they going to keep you?" he asked, changing the subject from the one he had dug into so deeply. She hesitated. "A year," she said, with more confidence than he had thought her hesitation would give her. "Then I'll be registered." After asking her all this, he felt compelled to reply with a reason for his own trip, that he would be leading a seminar on team and project management. She looked at him, not blankly exactly, but without the light of understanding that he was looking for in her eyes. He explained what he did, why companies hired him as a consultant, and to do these seminars, and what was meant by management. Still not finding that look of understanding, but only that she was following him with effort, he made use of what he knew and what she had just told him about hospitals, telling her that she was both an administrator of a sort and an advisor to companies with employees engaged in the same line of work. There were many things in what in what he said, that she knew or could have figured out for herself as well, but she said nothing and listened. Given enough time, she was sure she could understand it all. They both spoke about their jobs and generalities, without taking up any examples of patients or clients they had worked with as illustrations to what they said. She took the job, hectic as it assuredly was, well. He hoped he was taking his job as good as that. He could see no bags under her eyes or other such telling signs of overwork. Nearly every occupation in a hospital besides that of a doctor brought to his mind someone harried and tired. He didn't know and he didn't ask himself why that was. He wondered if the woman had seen what had happened between him and the thief. Maybe she had, and had even been offered a rose herself. He liked to think he could size people up, and she seemed like the sort of person, if the thieves really had approached her, to have stood there meekly while they did as they pleased. She wasn't the type to treat them as he had, though it was all the same in the end. If she met one of them, she'd break free eventually, but like him, only after the thief's patience gave out. Or maybe, with someone like her, the man wouldn't have bothered with tricks and would simply have overpowered her and run off. The impressions he had of people were the result of weighing evidence, and as strong as his first impression might be, it only needed enough evidence to the contrary and time to consider where the balance lay to overturn it. The stronger his impression of someone, the longer it took for him to doubt it, and with it to doubt himself. How quickly he grew used to people, he said to himself, even to strangers. He didn't know her name, and she didn't know his. Still, she had a place in his life now. He wondered how long that would last. The sound of a train arriving, the track squealing as it came to a stop, tore him away from the self-examination. He looked over his shoulder at the train, looked at his watch, and turned to the display that indicated which train it was that had arrived. It was on schedule, so was he, and knowing the time, it surprised him that it should still look so much like morning. The station was filling with people also going off to work. "My train is here, I have to go," he said as he got up. His tone was matter-of-fact, though as he thanked her for the conversation and wished her a good trip and that she should succeed in her internship, there was a note of regret in his voice. They couldn't go on talking as he would have liked. The trip went ahead without further incident. Once he was where his whole journey had been headed, he went over his notes in his hotel room again, slowly to refresh his memory. Between this he paused. For whole minutes at a time he did nothing, letting the day he had had so far catch up with him, or rather the other way around, he catching up with his day. He might hold his notes out before him or put them aside, but it made no difference. At such times he felt that his mind was completely empty, though in fact it was nearly full, and he was hard-pressed to fill it with anything more than was already there. Having read through his notes, he set an alarm and went to bed. His course was in the late afternoon or in the early evening, depending on how you saw it. A night class, he had called it. What was to be his classroom wasn't far from his hotel. He showered before he went out and put on some of the clothes he had brought with him to last him the week, not wanting to get back into what he had already worn. "So did everyone get here all right?" he asked as he came into the classroom. Some nodded, and he received murmured answers in the affirmative. There was still time until it started. He made conversation by telling those who were already there about the medical intern he had met and the trouble he'd gotten into with a thief. Hearing how he'd gotten here, hearing about his travels, some of them, particularly those in the first couple rows, told him about their own. They raised their hands as they spoke, in a way that suggested young students being called on, and that made him feel like a schoolteacher. There was no one there, he learned, that had had it as bad as him, but they didn't try to compare their hardships. They each said their piece and were all simply glad that they'd made it. People looked around and finding familiar faces, asked each other how they were and when they'd last met. It wasn't the first time here for many of them. He knew some people there and asked them the same questions. It wasn't his first time here either. It made him happy to see that people remembered him. The place, on the whole, was still new to him, however, because they didn't get much time to look around. He let them get settled in and then began with what they were there for. Unlike a school teacher, he didn't need to ask for silence. Once the hour came at which the course should start, he straightened himself and began speaking with more authority than he had used for their small talk. The class fell silent of their own accord. "Is everyone here?" he asked. Only some of them answered that time. "Good, then let's begin." For him to get settled took a good deal longer, until the course had ended and he was back in his hotel room. Ahead of him was the greater part of a 1-week seminar. The course he had put behind him was, it was true, introductory, and short compared to those that would follow, but not without substance. In the meantime, between work and bed, he went out into town with the others, a smaller group than had attended the seminar. They were no longer teacher and student, but on something like equal footing. He followed them, letting himself be carried along as if by a current. They went about the town with what remained of the day, whiling away the time. It was only a town, not a city, and not a particularly large one at that, or one much distinguished from the next town over by anyone or anything there. He liked to take such trips to get to know new places, even if it was just in the limited way that a trip like this allowed. The evening was cold, and he put his rain jacket on before he went out, remembering as he did so how he had put it on that morning, and thinking how much more distant the morning seemed than it was. He felt sure this had been the longest day of his life, and hoped that he wouldn't see another like it. The weather, though it was not raining, was as cool as it had been that morning. Between morning and evening, as he had been on one train or another and been making his way from station to station, the temperature had risen as the sun had come out, and then it had plateaued. It was as constant as the sun in keeping its position. As it became night and the temperature kept falling, he heard one of his students say he wished he'd brought a coat along. Mostly, though, they didn't talk about it. The crowd thinned out as the hours went. He stayed while the first of them left, noticing the time and thinking of what he had to do tomorrow, said his goodbyes, and turning in early, went with the second round of departures. That was Station to Station, written and read by Philip Ballerscheff. Once again, if you'd like to read along as I read this story, you can find a link to my blog in the description of this video. And as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you, and until next time.